The sea was already dark when the story of Medea began to drift across the old world, dark and patient, with the kind of quiet that seems to hold memory in it. In the distance, beyond familiar shores, there was said to be a kingdom where the sun rose over strange lands, where rivers ran into forests, and where a princess with a careful mind learned the names of roots and herbs. Her story would travel far from there, and it would never move quickly. It would cross water and cities and islands and narrow corridors of power, and it would leave behind the feeling that some lives are made not of peace, but of long, echoing choices. Medea is one of those figures who seems to stand near a doorway in myth, half in one world, half in another. She is remembered as a sorceress, a daughter, a helper, a wife, an exile, and in the oldest telling, a person who knows the hidden strength of the earth. That is a good place to begin, with the earth itself. Ancient people noticed that certain plants soothed pain, that others could bring sleep, that some leaves could color the skin or quiet a fever. In stories, this knowledge often became something larger than knowledge. It became wonder. It became power. And when a person seemed to understand the secret language of herbs, people began to speak of magic. In some versions, Medea is the daughter of a king named Eets, who ruled in Colchis, a land placed at the far edge of the Greek imagination. Colchis was not a place many listeners could picture clearly. That often made it feel more mysterious. It lay beyond the ordinary routes of home and harvest, somewhere near the eastern sea where the air might have felt different, where gold might have been washed from riverbeds, and where old stories liked to imagine that strange things grew in the soil. The Greeks did this often. When a land was distant, it became large in the mind. When it was large in the mind, it became a place where impossible events could seem natural. And so Medea first appears in the story as someone connected to distance. She belongs to the faraway edge, to a place the Greeks knew by rumor, trade, and imagination. This matters because myth often begins where certainty ends. It is not always trying to report what happened. Sometimes it is trying to describe the feeling of what happened, the way one life can enter another life and alter its shape forever. Then comes Jason, and with him comes the long, slow movement of the Argonauts, that old band of sailors who traveled in search of the Golden Fleece. Even that phrase feels quiet when spoken slowly, Golden Fleece, a bright object at the end of a long road. The fleece itself was a prize, but also a symbol of difficult recovery, of a thing that must be earned across water and danger and strange hospitality. In the background of the tale is the ship Argo, which seems almost like a dream of early travel, a wooden vessel carrying people into uncertainties that they could not fully map. The journey itself was one of the most beloved in Greek myth, not because it was easy, but because it brought together many small wonders. There were oars striking water, coastlines drifting past, and islands where each landing carried a different problem. Some stories in antiquity move like storms. This one can also feel like a long passage through changing weather, with each episode giving the listener a new shore to rest on for a moment before the sea begins again. When Jason reaches Colchis, the story becomes more intimate. Many old myths like to gather grand events around a single room. A palace, a court, a king. A daughter standing nearby, listening. Eets sets difficult tasks before Jason, and the tasks themselves have the calm, terrible logic of myth. He must yoke fire-breathing bulls. He must plough a field. He must sow dragon's teeth and face the warriors who rise from the earth. These are not ordinary difficulties. They are images that feel shaped by imagination out of older fears. Fire, soil, teeth, men rising from the ground, all of it rooted in the ancient sense that the world is alive with powers that do not ask permission. And it is here that Medea changes the direction of the tale. She sees Jason and she helps him. In some versions she falls in love. In others, the gods incline her heart. In all of them, she becomes the hidden hinge on which the story turns. She brings ointments, instructions, and counsel. She knows what the king does not expect her to know. She gives Jason the means to survive the impossible tasks. That kind of help appears often in myth, but it is rarely simple. Assistance is never just assistance. It can be a bridge. It can also become a cost. There is something haunting about a person whose skill is made useful only when someone else needs to succeed. Medea is not merely an ornament in the tale. She is intelligent, practical, and deeply rooted in a tradition of wisdom that older stories sometimes place in women, especially women who live close to medicine, ritual, or the household's hidden workings. One can imagine her hands measuring powders, her gaze steady, her mind moving through consequences before anyone else notices them. Greek myth often gives us heroes who act, but it also gives us figures who understand. Medea belongs to the second group, and then painfully she is pushed into the first. Jason wins the fleece, or at least escapes with it, and Medea leaves with him. That simple sentence has within it many centuries of sorrow. She leaves home. She crosses from Colchis into the Greek world. She becomes a foreign woman in a Greek tale, a woman whose otherness is never fully forgotten. This is one reason her story can feel so quiet and so severe. Exile changes the texture of everything. The air is different, the names are different. Even kindness can feel temporary when you are far from the place that first recognized you. In some retellings, Medea helps Jason in ways that are almost tender to imagine. She uses her knowledge to protect him from sleeping dragons and impossible obstacles. She may even rejuvenate Jason's father, Aeson, in a display of magic that connects her to the old longing to restore what time has taken away. There is a strange softness in these episodes. For a moment, the story pauses near healing. Age is lightened. Vitality returns. The old body is made young again. Ancient audiences would have known the ache behind such scenes, because time is one of the few forces no one escapes. To imagine reversing it, even briefly, is to imagine a world where sorrow can be handled with care. But myth rarely stays in the bright part of the room for long. Jason and Medea eventually arrive in Corinth in many versions of the tale, and there the long shadow begins to lengthen. Their lives settle for a while, as lives in stories sometimes do before they become difficult again. Settling in ancient myth often means the quiet arrangement of domestic life, a house, children, the ordinary pressure of survival, and under all of it the old unresolved matter that has not gone away. Medea's foreignness remains, Jason's ambitions remain, the world around them remains watchful, and the old blessing of the gods is never reliable for very long. There is a particular sadness in the way some myths let time pass before turning. It makes the later grief feel more human. A brief happiness, or something like it, allows the listener to imagine that the couple might have become ordinary, that they might have lived among pots and bread and afternoon light. But Greek myth is often unwilling to let such moments stand without complication. It keeps asking what lies under the surface of a marriage, a promise, a pact, a rescue. And in Medea's case, what lies beneath is the knowledge that she gave up a world for a man, and that the man may not have understood the full meaning of the gift. One of the most famous parts of the story comes when Jason turns toward another marriage, seeking advancement through another union. In the old telling, this is not framed as a small mistake. It is a profound breach. He plans to marry a Corinthian princess, joining himself to local power. That kind of movement was familiar in ancient politics. Marriages often strengthened alliances. They brought households together, shaped inheritance, and secured status. But in myth, practical decisions do not remain practical for long. They become emotional weather. The atmosphere changes. The people in the room begin to feel the cost of rearranging loyalty. Medea's response has made her one of the most discussed figures in all mythology. She is wounded. She is displaced again. She is turned, not for the first time, into the person whose labor and sacrifice are made secondary to another's future. The old poets did not always agree on the details, but they consistently placed her at the center of moral unease. She is not presented as simple. That is part of why she remains so memorable. She holds several truths at once. She is loving, dangerous, brilliant, and suffering. In myth, such a combination is often enough to keep a figure alive for millennia. There is also the question of speech. Medea speaks with clarity. She argues, she reasons. She warns, she pleads. In some traditions, she is the only one in the room who fully understands what is at stake. That can make her feel lonely even before the worst moments arrive. To be clear-minded in an unkind situation is its own kind of exile. The other characters may be moving in the bright confidence of their plans, but she sees the cost. Myth gives us many forms of sight. Some eyes notice omens, some eyes notice fate. Medea often seems to see the emotional future before everyone else does. The story that follows is known for tragedy, and I will not rush it. Tragedy in old stories is not only about terrible acts, it is also about the slow narrowing of choices. A door closes, another closes, the room grows smaller. A person who once had many paths now has only a few, and each one leads to pain. This is one reason the tale can feel so heavy, but from a distance, if we let it settle into quiet observation, it also becomes a study in human pressure. What happens to loyalty when humiliation grows? What happens to intelligence when it has nowhere gentle to go? What happens when a person is asked to remain generous after being deeply betrayed? In the famous Corinthian scenes, Medea offers gifts to the new bride, gifts that appear beautiful and harmless. The objects themselves are part of the old world's fascination with fabric, metal, and fine workmanship. A robe, a crown, things made to glitter in lamplight. In myth, beautiful objects are often not just decorations. They carry intention. They can carry blessing and they can carry ruin. It is interesting how often ancient stories place power in textiles and ornaments. Cloth was expensive, meaningful, and labor-intensive. A garment could signify status, devotion, or hidden danger. The old imagination knew that surfaces matter and that what touches the skin can alter fate. Medea's revenge, as preserved in the most famous traditions, is among the most painful in literature. It is one of the reasons people return to her story with caution and fascination. Yet even here, the calm listener may notice that the myth is not offering a simple lesson. It is showing what happens when betrayal, pride, and power collide without mercy. It is showing a person who has been cornered by a society that does not know what to do with her except fear her. It is showing the consequences of making another human being invisible until they become impossible to ignore. The children, too, are part of the sorrow, and this is where the story becomes one that ancient audiences likely felt in the body, not just in the mind. Family in Greek myth is often unstable, but the presence of children brings the stakes close to the hearth. Children are the future of a household, the continuation of name and line. When tragedy reaches them, the violence of the old world feels especially stark. The tale refuses comfort. It does not let the listener remain at a safe distance, and perhaps that is why it survived. It knew how to trouble the heart. Still, even with all its harshness, the story of Medea is not only about destruction. It is also about knowledge carried by a woman who moves through empires and kingdoms as if she knows their hidden seams. She can heal and she can harm. She can counsel and she can accuse. Her power is not the clean power of a throne. It is something older and stranger, tied to roots, waters, words, and thresholds. The Greeks often feared such power, especially when it belonged to someone outside the expected order. Fear can become myth very quickly, and myth can preserve fear for a very long time. If we step back from the most famous scenes, we can see a wider landscape around Medea. We can imagine the ports where ships came in with salted ropes, the markets where goods from distant regions changed hands, the homes where women prepared meals and watched children play in dust and sunlight. Ancient Greece was not only temples and epics, it was daily labor, weather, olives, wool, and the long repetition of ordinary life. Medea's world belongs to that same fabric, even when the story lifts her into enchantment. Her magic still depends on the natural world. Roots have to be found, plants have to be gathered, mixed powders have to be measured. Even in myth, there is often a practical foundation beneath the wonder. That mixture of practical and impossible is one reason ancient tales remain so breathable, so easy to drift into and out of. You can listen to them as if they were dreams, but they are also built from familiar materials. A house. A marriage, a forest edge, a field, a knife, a cup of oil, a distant sea, a name spoken carefully. All of these objects feel close. Myth takes them and lets them glow in the dark. There are also older echoes in Medea's story, older than the surviving Greek texts themselves. The figure of the dangerous, knowledgeable woman appears in many cultures. She may be healer, witch, priestess, or outsider. She may stand at the boundary where the community both needs and mistrusts her. That pattern is quiet but persistent. It says something about how people imagine authority when it does not wear the usual face. Medea, in that sense, is not only one character. She is a shape that reappears in different ages, a reminder that fear and admiration often grow in the same soil. And yet she is still singular. The ancient tragedians gave her language that burns with intelligence, while later storytellers turned her into a symbol of abandonment, foreignness, or ungoverned rage. Each layer adds another lamp to the corridor. The older you make the story, the more rooms it seems to have. That is how myths behave. They do not stay still. They accumulate dust and shine. They are retold by poets, dramatists, scholars, and dreamers, and each retelling changes the angle of the light. If you imagine Medea at rest, it is difficult. Rest is not the condition she is most remembered for. But perhaps there were moments before Jason, before the voyage, before the palace rooms and the hard speeches, when she walked through gardens or watched the sea from a quiet stone ledge. Perhaps she knew the names of birds. Perhaps she knew which plants opened at dawn. Ancient stories rarely preserve such gentle details, but the mind can supply them softly. It can place her among leaves, where a breeze moves just enough to shift the shadows on her sleeve. It is also worth remembering that Greek myth was shaped by oral tradition long before it was written down in the forms we now know. This means the tale of Medea traveled in voices. It was carried by performers, listeners, families, and cities. It changed with each telling. A pause could lengthen, a detail could sharpen, a motive could soften. In that sense, the story itself is like a river, never identical from one place to the next. The written version is only one bank of something much older and more fluid. When we listen now, so many centuries later, it may help to think of the story not as a verdict but as a chamber of echoes. Jason's ambition echoes, Medea's intelligence echoes, the sea echoes, Exile echoes. The golden fleece is almost less important than the path it draws through the world, a path that leads from wonder into compromise, from help into debt, from closeness into separation. That arc feels ancient because it is ancient, but it also feels close because human beings still live inside similar patterns, though usually in quieter forms. There are two other Medeas in later literature, and that is another sign of endurance. Poets and playwrights returned to her because she was hard to dismiss. She was too vivid, too difficult, too alive in the imagination. Some versions emphasized her foreignness, others her grief, others her dreadful retaliation. Over time, she became a figure used to explore the tensions between reason and passion, home and exile, power and vulnerability. But underneath all that criticism and commentary, there remains the original image, a woman from a distant land, standing near a king's house, knowing things others do not. A bedtime listener might prefer the quieter parts of the myth, the roads before the storm. So let us linger there a little longer. Imagine the ship Argo resting at anchor in a sheltered inlet. The ropes are coiled, the sail is furled, the water moves with a patient sound against the hull. A few men speak softly in the evening. Beyond them, on the shore, there are stones warmed by the day and cooling now into night. This is the kind of scene that myth often leaves in the background, but it is a restful one, full of ordinary textures. Even a heroic voyage spends much of its time waiting. And Medea, wherever she stands in these early moments, is not only a character of fire. She is a person with a mind. She listens, she calculates, she understands consequence. Such qualities are easy to forget when the later tragedy dominates, but they matter. They make the story more human. The old world was full of people who survived by noticing details: which path was safer, which river flooded, which stranger could be trusted, which promise sounded too polished. Medea belongs to that world of attention where knowledge is often the difference between life and loss. Golden fleece itself is a lovely object to picture before sleep. It belongs to the category of things that seem to glow even in the mind. A fleece is soft, domestic, familiar. Gold is rare, bright, impossible to ignore. Together they create a contrast that is almost dreamlike, something at once pastoral and royal. The fleece was not just treasure. It was also a sign that the journey had been successful, that the hard and strange road had led to proof. In myth, however, proof never stays pure. The taking of treasure has consequences. Returning home is never simple. The object that ends the quest often begins another. That is one reason Medea's story feels so large. It is not only about what she does. It is about what the human heart does after it has been pulled across long distances. Love can become dependence. Help can become expectation. Gratitude can become entitlement. Fear can become cruelty. Ancient myth, with all its gods and monsters, often tells the story of these slower transformations. The gods may step in, but the deepest changes happen in the space between people. If you are listening late at night, it may be enough simply to let the names pass by like shoreline lights. Medea, Jason, Eets, Corinth, Colchis, Argo, they sound like stones dropped into deep water. Each one creates a circle that widens and quiets. That is part of the charm of old names. They do not merely identify people and places, they carry atmosphere. They keep the ancient air around them. There is another soft way to think about Medea, one that does not excuse the darkness of the tale but places it inside a broader human pattern. She is a figure who reveals the vulnerability of the person who gives up home for love or loyalty. To leave one's own people is never a small matter. It changes how every future event will feel. A minor slight may seem larger. A disappointment may cut deeper. Even gratitude may feel complicated. Medea's later pain can be understood, at least in part, as the pain of someone who has no simple route back to where she began. In some ancient societies, women's movement was limited, their identities tied closely to household and kin. Medea's travel across the sea therefore made her mythically charged. She is not only a woman in distress. She is a person detached from the network that usually protects and defines her. That detached condition gives the story its tension. She has intelligence but not security. She has knowledge but not welcome. She has agency but not a safe place to use it. The result is a narrative that feels both intimate and vast. And still, the myth is full of beautiful surfaces. Bronze helmets, wool dyed deep red, salt on dark hair, the pale line of a harbour at dawn. Roof tiles warming under the sun, the smell of cedar. The old writers knew how to place beauty alongside danger. Perhaps they understood that the world itself does this. A bright day can hold grief. A banquet can hold betrayal. A lullaby can be heard in a house where fear is also present. Medea's story in this way is not unusual. It is simply more concentrated than most. As we move toward the quieter edges of the myth, we can also notice how often it asks what a person owes to the one who helped them. Jason owes Medea everything in one sense, and yet the story shows how quickly gratitude can be rewritten by ambition. That is a gentle but painful observation, and perhaps one that listeners recognize in more ordinary settings too. Human memory is selective. It keeps some debts close and lets others fade. Myth exaggerates that tendency until it becomes visible. There are versions of Medea in which she escapes on a chariot sent by the sun, a strange and unforgettable image, almost like a dream of being carried beyond the world's edge. Even in that ending, the story remains suspended between pain and elevation. She does not simply vanish. She departs in a blaze of divine conveyance, as if the myth cannot decide whether to condemn her, pity her, or both. That uncertainty is one of the reasons she lingers in the mind after other figures have gone quiet. She resists final simplification. For the listener who wants something soothing in her story, there is comfort in the rhythm of return. The story keeps circling back to the same elements: a woman with knowledge, a man with ambition, a journey across water, a household under strain, a foreign land remembered from afar, a gift that may be a blessing or a trap. This repetition has the softness of waves, even when the content is severe, and perhaps that is enough for a bedtime hour. Not to solve the myth, but to let it drift. The ancient Greeks would have encountered Medea through poetry, theatre, and memory. They would have heard her in public places, in festivals, in spaces where the whole city could listen together. That meant the story was also social. It was a way of thinking aloud about marriage, foreignness, loyalty, and the dangers of neglecting the person who understands you best. These are old concerns, yet they remain easy to recognize. A myth survives partly because it keeps finding new rooms in new centuries. The setting of Corinth when it appears is especially interesting because Corinth itself was a prosperous and strategically placed city, a place of trade and movement. That makes it a fitting stage for a story about ambition and displacement. Cities like Corinth were full of arrivals and departures. Goods passed through, people came and went, alliances changed. In such a place, identity could feel both public and unstable. Medea, already an outsider, stands out more sharply there. She is near the center, but not of it. That is a position that ancient stories often reserve for figures whose fate is about to turn. At this point, it is calming to remember that not every part of myth asks to be held tightly. Some parts can just be passed by like fields seen from a carriage window, green in the distance, then gone. The children, the house, the kingship, the crowns, the arguments, the old debts, all of it moves through the mind and then settles. What remains is the shape of a life made difficult by choice and response. That shape is what has endured. And so, before we let the story grow even quieter, let us think once more of the earliest Medea, the one standing at the edge of the map. She knows the names of plants. She knows how to mix what the earth provides. She belongs to a place the Greeks called remote, though remote places are often only places not yet fully understood. She is young in some versions, wise in others, and in all of them she is more complex than the labels placed upon her. That complexity is the soft center of her legend. If the night is very still, you might imagine her walking alone near a river, the hem of her robe brushing grass, the air cool on her wrists. Nothing dramatic happens in that moment. There is only movement and distance and the quiet certainty that stories are made from such moments as much as from the loud ones. A turning of the head, a hand reaching for a sprig of leaf, the sound of water over stones, a thought kept private. That is perhaps the most restful way to keep Medea company, not as an emblem of fury, but as a figure traveling through the long corridors of myth, carrying her knowledge, her grief, and her dignity. The sea remains beside her. The distant kingdom remains behind her. The Greek city waits ahead with all its human confusion, and over all of it lies the old, patient rhythm of telling and retelling, like waves touching shore in the dark. So let the story soften now. Let the palace walls dim. Let the golden fleece lose its brightness and become only a woven thing, hanging quietly in memory. Let the names settle into silence. Medea remains not as a shouted ending, but as a presence at the edge of the lamplight, thoughtful and far away, another small and ancient shape in the great and resting night. And if you are still listening, there is no need to hurry anywhere. Ancient stories can linger as long as the room allows. The old world often has that effect, especially in the late hours, when a tale of exile and intelligence and sea crossing feels less like a lesson and more like a companionable shadow. Medea's life as the poets gave it to us is not made gentle by distance, but distance does make room for reflection. It lets us look at the edges of the tale where meaning gathers quietly. One edge is Colchis, that far country which the Greeks imagined with such fascination. It is worth pausing there again, because distant places in myth are often built from a mixture of trade, rumour and desire. Colchis may have suggested wealth, because gold was said to be found there. It may have suggested forests, because forests belong to the margins of mapped lands. It may have suggested unfamiliar customs, because the farther away a people seemed, the more carefully the imagination filled in the gaps. Medea emerges from that imagined far shore. and so she arrives in Greek memory already wrapped in distance. Another edge is language. Medea's name itself has a soft but firm sound, and names in myth often carry hints of character. Ancient listeners would have heard it spoken with the authority given to figures who move the plot. A name, repeated over generations, can become a kind of vessel. It can hold admiration, fear, pity, and blame all at once. This is one reason myth survives. It reduces no one to a single shape, not even when later tellings try to do so. There is also the edge of the household, which in the ancient world was both private and political. A home was not just a place of rest. It was a site of lineage, labor, and reputation. When Medea's family life fractures, the break is not only emotional, it touches the structure around her. In old stories, the household is often where larger changes are first felt, as if the whole city begins with the arrangement of chairs and the distribution of bread. That smallness is deceptive. A domestic decision can become a public catastrophe. For a bedtime story, it can help to notice the small objects before the great events. A cup on a table, a folded garment, a door lintel, a hearth with low coals. Ancient Greek homes often centered on the hearth, and the hearth itself is a quiet symbol. It holds warmth, it marks continuity, it gathers the family. In Medea's story, the hearth is never fully safe. Even the domestic center becomes uncertain. That tension gives the tale much of its sad power. What should protect is what is threatened. The tragedy also reminds us how often myth associates intelligence with danger when intelligence belongs to a woman. Medea understands medicines, poisons, transformations, and the hidden workings of things. The culture that tells her story is fascinated by her and unsettled by her at the same time. That mix produces a character who is endlessly reusable because she embodies a question ancient societies asked again and again. What happens when knowledge does not stay where authority expects it to stay? In a calmer light, we might say that Medea represents competence under pressure. She sees what must be done, she can do what others cannot, but competence, when betrayed, can turn inward. It can sharpen, it can become merciless. The old poets understood that intelligence is not always comforting. Sometimes it simply means a person can perceive the full extent of the wound. That knowledge does not heal the wound, it only makes it visible. Jason, by contrast, is often remembered less for brilliance than for movement. He is the one who seeks, travels, claims, and returns. He belongs to the logic of quests. That makes him attractive to epic storytelling, which loves purpose and forward motion. But forward motion can hide weakness. In some readings, Jason is not truly heroic in the grand sense. He depends on others, including Medea, and then fails them. That failure is quiet in the beginning and devastating later. Myth has a patient way of exposing such things. If one listens to the story slowly, one can almost hear its pauses. Ancient poets did not just rush from event to event. They knew the value of delay, of attention, of letting a line settle. That gives modern listeners a place to rest. Between the tasks, there is the field. Between the voyage and the marriage, there is the harbor. Between the promise and the betrayal, there is the ordinary interval where people eat, speak, and believe that tomorrow will resemble today. This middle space is easy to forget, but it is where life usually happens. The more one sits with Medea, the more one sees how much of her story is about belonging or the loss of it. She leaves home to help Jason. She enters Greece as an outsider. She is accepted only conditionally. When her usefulness is spent, her place becomes unstable. That pattern is sadly familiar across history, which may be one reason the myth remains alive. It is not just ancient. It keeps recurring in different clothes, in different languages, under different roofs. The tale also opens a window onto ancient travel. Sea voyages were long, uncertain, and physically demanding. Wind mattered, weather mattered, landfalls mattered. A journey from one coast to another could transform a life because it took time, and time allowed choices to harden. There is a special stillness in old travel stories because so much of the motion was slow. There were no instant crossings, no impatient arrivals. One lived with the sea for days or weeks. One listened to its moods. That slowness gives myth a natural nighttime quality. Medea's magic, too, belongs to that world of careful preparation. It is not the grand, sparkling sort of sorcery found in later fantasy. It is more like ritual knowledge, technical and intimate. Mix this, heat that, whisper this. Avoid that plant. Carry this charm. Such practices would not have seemed unbelievable to ancient listeners. The line between medicine, prayer, and magic was often gentle. A cure and a curse could feel like neighboring rooms. The story of Medea takes that closeness and makes it memorable. There is a beautiful irony in the fact that the figure often treated as monstrous is also one of the most articulate in Greek tragedy. She speaks with force because she has been pushed to the edge. In that sense, the horror of the tale is not only in what happens, but in how a person arrives at the place where such things become thinkable. That is a quiet and unsettling process, and the old myths knew it well. They were not afraid to ask what betrayal does to the inner life. Sometimes, for those who like to picture ancient scenes before sleeping, it is peaceful to imagine the surfaces of the world around Medea. Terracotta vessels cooled after the fire, linen drying in shade. See birds wheeling over an inlet, a woman's sandals resting by a threshold, a bronze mirror catching a dim reflection. These details do not resolve the tragedy. They simply humanize the world in which it took shape. Myth feels softer when it is seen through ordinary things. The story of Medea has also been preserved through the selective habits of later readers. Some were interested in moral lessons, some in tragic structure, some in the character of the woman herself. Each age finds a different door into the same old house. That is why the myth can still be introduced gently, without the need to force a single conclusion. It is enough to say that here is a person who was loved, used, feared, and remembered. That is already a very old pattern. And perhaps as the night becomes deeper, it is enough to let the older sound of the tale come forward. The sound of the sea, the sound of distant oars, the sound of a name spoken in sorrow, the sound of a city that believes it knows who belongs inside it and who does not. Medea stands between those sounds, carrying the quiet tension of a life that cannot be made simple again. The myths that remain with us are often the ones that resist being drained of feeling. Medea resists. She does not become smaller when we look at her carefully. She becomes more layered. The farther we follow her, the more the story opens into questions about trust, power, family, and the cost of being seen only when one is useful. Those are not dramatic questions in the loud sense. They are the sort that settle slowly like evening dust in a room. So if the listening has become drowsy now, let it continue that way. Imagine the dark sea beyond Corinth, then the far-off forests of Colchis, then the ship Argo resting in a harbour of memory. Imagine Medea not as an ending, but as a figure moving quietly between places, an exile with sharp eyes, a woman of plants and words, a name that ancient poets did not let go. The story does not need to hurry. It can remain in the air as long as you need it. And if there is still a little wakefulness left, there are always more small things to notice. The way ancient people measured time by the sun and shadows, the way a foreign accent could make a person feel suddenly exposed, the way gifts carried meaning beyond their beauty, the way a ship at sea could seem both fragile and immense, the way grief can turn a room silent, the way myth preserves such experiences by dressing them in kings and quests, but never fully hiding the human heart underneath. Medea's tale, in the end, is one of those old stories that stays near the edge of consciousness. It does not demand a conclusion. It simply keeps offering the shape of a life that moved through wonder, betrayal, and exile. That shape is enough for a quiet night. It is enough to let the mind rest on old stones, on dark water, on a far shore where a woman once knew the names of healing roots and was not yet famous for sorrow. So let the room grow softer now. Let the ancient names loosen their grip and drift into the background. Let the sea become only a sound. Let the golden fleece become only a glimmer. Let Medea remain where myths often leave their deepest figures, at the boundary between knowledge and loss, waiting in the half-light, while the night goes on, gentle and wide and still. There is something quietly haunting about the way Greek myth often leaves women standing at thresholds, not always at the center of public power, and not entirely hidden either, but at the edge of departure, arrival, and decision. Medea belongs to that kind of place. She is not only a figure of violence or revenge, as later retellings sometimes make her seem, she is also a figure of passage, of crossing from one world into another and never quite being allowed to settle in either. That in-between quality gives her story a particular stillness, even in its darkest moments, because exile itself is a kind of silence. It is an interruption in the life of belonging. To imagine Medea calmly is not to soften what the myth has remembered, but to notice the older and quieter frame around it. Long before the final catastrophes in Corinth, there is the distant eastern shore of the Black Sea, a region the Greeks call the edge of the known world. For the people who lived there, it was not an edge at all, of course, but a place of rivers, forests, trade, and memory. The Greeks imagined Colchis as remote, rich, and strange. Gold might have been gathered there from riverbeds, perhaps with fleeces laid in streams to catch fine particles of metal, a practical detail that could easily have grown into wonder as it travelled from one telling to another. Such is often the quiet path by which history becomes myth. A technique becomes a treasure, a region becomes a marvel, a foreign land becomes a place where heroes must go to find themselves. Medea's home, then, lies in a landscape that is both very real and half-sunken in legend. It is useful, when thinking slowly about her, to picture the kinds of things that might have been there. Wooden vessels darkened by smoke, steep hills with paths worn by feet, herbs growing beside streams, animals moving through morning mist, the smell of wet earth after rain. Ancient stories rarely preserve ordinary weather directly, yet they depend on it. A myth needs places to stand in. A tale about flight and sorcery still begins in the same world of roads, doors, fields, and kitchens that every human life depends on. Medea's knowledge of plants, in particular, feels rooted in this kind of earthiness. Before it became an emblem of danger, it would have belonged to a wider ancient understanding that healing and harm often used the same materials. Roots, leaves, resins, bark, powders, and steeped mixtures were part of medicine, ritual, and household life across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. A plant could soothe a fever or, in the wrong amount, become poison. The line between care and threat was often thinner than we like to imagine. This is one reason Medea remains such a compelling figure. She belongs to the old world of remedies, where knowledge was intimate and practical, passed from hand to hand, from elder to learner, from one generation to the next. In many ancient societies, women were the keepers of much of this knowledge, though rarely recorded in the way kings and scribes were recorded. They knew which herbs could calm a child, which could ease a birth, which could dye cloth, which could scent a room, which could be used in ritual, and which might be dangerous if handled without skill. The myth of Medea gathers some of that diffused knowledge into a single unforgettable person. She becomes, in the imagination of later ages, the one who knows too much, the woman whose understanding cannot be contained by the ordinary expectations placed upon her. And yet even this is only part of her. She is not simply a magician in isolation. She is, at least in the earliest remembered shape of the tale, a princess, a daughter, a helper, a traveller. She makes choices. She enters into a bond that is both intimate and political. Jason arrives in Colchis as leader of the Argonauts, the crew of an exceptional ship, and the voyage itself belongs to the ancient Greek fascination with impossible journeys. To travel far was to encounter the strange order of the world. The sea did not merely connect lands, it tested them. The Argo, in story after story, becomes more than wood and sail. It is a vessel of aspiration, a little enclosed world carrying men toward fame and uncertainty. Ships in the ancient Mediterranean were not romantic conveniences. They were risky, crowded, dependent on weather, skill, and luck. To send a vessel out across open water was always to accept that it might not return. That vulnerability gives the Argonaut story its quiet weight. The heroes are not only adventurers, they are temporary inhabitants of a floating threshold. In such stories, help becomes a profound act. Medea's aid to Jason is not a small gesture, it is a turning of the entire tale. The tasks set before Jason are the kinds of impossible labors found throughout myth, those tests that measure not just strength but fortune, wit, and the grace of hidden alliances. Medea's intervention makes success possible. Ancient audiences would have recognized how extraordinary that is. Help in myth is never merely functional. It creates obligation, memory, and risk. To receive assistance in a heroic tale is often to enter a moral debt that may never be fully repaid. The story of Jason and Medea seems to unfold under the shadow of that ancient understanding. A gift given in a moment of danger does not simply disappear once the danger has passed. If the story is followed gently, there is a strange tenderness in the way it begins. Not tenderness in the modern sense of comfort, but in the sense of intense attention. Medea sees Jason and chooses. Jason accepts her aid and departs. The sea opens. The homeland is left behind. This is a common structure in myth, the crossing from known place to unknown, but with Medea the emotional consequences feel sharper because she is not merely a companion on the journey. She becomes the one who must leave her own world to preserve the bond she has made. Exile can begin before a person has physically departed. It can begin in the inward recognition that one's life has already become difficult to return to. There are ancient stories where homes are lost by war, by famine, by political change, by family fracture. There are also quieter displacements, the kind that happen when a person marries into another household and must adapt to new habits, new customs, new expectations. In the ancient world, moving from one city or land to another could mean entering a completely different rhythm of life. Dialects changed, dress changed, ritual changed, the shape of authority changed. Medea, as a foreign woman in Greek lands, would have been seen through many layers of difference. She is not only a woman in a story, she is a stranger, and ancient literature often gives strangers an unstable dignity. They can be welcomed as guests, admired for their mystery, and then turned into threats the moment fear or convenience shifts. That instability is part of the sorrow of her myth. It is worth lingering, too, on the idea of the household in antiquity. The oikos, the home, was not merely a building. It was a web of family members, servants, dependents, possessions, rituals, and inheritance. To be expelled from it, or to have it broken apart, meant a deep wound to identity. A person's place in the house was their place in the moral and social order. For women, whose lives were often tied to domestic space, the home could be both protection and confinement. Medea's story moves through this tension with terrible clarity. She is not simply a wanderer at large. She becomes a woman whose domestic place is taken away from her. The betrayal occurs not in a battlefield, but in the intimate architecture of marriage and parenthood. That intimacy is part of what makes the myth so enduringly unsettling. The children, in many versions of the story, arrive as a point where the myth grows too painful to hold easily. Ancient tales often use family bonds as the measure of deepest loyalty and deepest rupture. To think about Medea and her children is to enter a space where narrative and moral imagination become especially fraught. Later tellers struggled with the implications, sometimes altering details, sometimes shifting blame, sometimes emphasizing divine forces, sometimes focusing on Medea's fury. There is no single uncontested version that resolves the discomfort. That lack of resolution may be one reason the myth remains alive. It continues to trouble the boundary between grief and culpability, between a person wronged and a person who wrongs in return. Human history in quieter moments is full of such difficult crossings. Ancient literature understood that family is not only a place of love, it is also where power can become invisible because it is so close. Yet even in a nighttime telling, it may help to notice how often myth preserves not only catastrophe but aftermath. After something terrible happens, what remains? A doorway, a piece of clothing, a vessel, a name, a memory passed through another generation. Ancient myths know that the aftermath is often where the world becomes hardest to rebuild. The ancient Greek city-states were themselves vulnerable to cycles of alliance, rivalry, migration, and war. Families were bound to civic identity. To be cut away from one's family could mean to stand outside not just emotional belonging, but legal and social recognition. Medea's exile is therefore more than personal. It reveals the fragility of the order that claims to protect households while also depending on the erasure of those who do not fit neatly within them. Corinth, where the later part of the story is often set, was itself an important and prosperous city, known for trade, craftsmanship, and strategic position. In a broad historical imagination, one can picture its harbours busy with exchange, its markets filled with goods from different regions, its roads carrying both wealth and rumour. Cities like Corinth were places where strangers might pass through, where cultures met, where old aristocratic households maintained prestige amid changing fortunes. A story of arrival and displacement set there would resonate with audiences who understood how quickly standing could shift. The city in myth is never just a backdrop. It is a social machine, a place where reputation and exclusion are constantly being negotiated. Medea, arriving as foreign wife and mother, enters this machine at its most dangerous point, when the story's private betrayal begins to echo through public consequences. Ancient tragedy, especially as it developed in Athens, was deeply interested in what happens when the household and the city collide. Tragedy puts individuals under pressure from laws, customs, divine commands, and family obligations that cannot all be satisfied at once. Medea, as dramatized by Euripides, becomes one of the most famous figures in this genre because she exposes how thin the line can be between civilization and collapse. Yet even without the theatrical intensity, the quieter mythic material already contains this conflict. The helper from the distant land becomes the abandoned wife in a Greek city. The outsider becomes dangerous. The gift giver becomes the avenger. The pattern is ancient and painfully recognizable. It is also fascinating in a calmer historical sense to remember that Greek myths were not static. They were recited, performed, adapted, and remembered differently in different places. The Medea known from epic fragments, from tragic stage, from later Roman retellings, from vase paintings and learned commentaries, is never quite the same person. Her story travels, and in traveling it changes costume. That is true of many myths. A tale can be carried by sailors, by merchants, by poets, by actors, by teachers, by parents speaking to children, by philosophers looking for examples, by artists seeking a powerful image. Each retelling leaves a small fingerprint. Over time, the myth becomes a layered object, like an ancient stone reused in a later wall. One can still see the older shape beneath, but it is partly covered by new constructions. This layered quality makes Medea especially suitable for thoughtful, slow listening. She is not a simple symbol, she is a repository of transformations. She is a healer, a foreigner, a bride, a mother, a betrayed partner, a dangerous intelligence, a figure of speech for passion, a subject of ethical debate. The ancient world often used such figures to think through anxieties it could not easily solve. What happens when intelligence is not submissive? What happens when a household depends on someone who is then discarded? What happens when a stranger knows the language of the land's fears better than the land itself knows them? These are not only mythic questions. They belong to the long history of human communities. There is a mild and curious thought that can be tucked into the tale here. Ancient peoples across many regions believed that the most potent knowledge was often border knowledge. The skill of those who moved between categories, between home and field, city and wilderness, human and divine, cure and poison, living and dead, was often feared and respected at once. Medea stands at that border. Her craft touches herbs, fire, speech, oath, and desire. In a world where unseen forces were not sharply separated from everyday life, such a person would have seemed both necessary and unsettling. The myth preserves that unease. It does not resolve it. It lets it remain like an echo in a stone chamber. The Greek imagination also often associated women with lamentation, mourning songs, and the domestic sounds of grief. This is one of the reasons Medea's story lands so heavily in the ear. Her voice matters. She speaks, argues, pleads, plans, and declares. In many ancient settings, public speech was a mark of authority, and tragedy gives women a space to speak that ordinary civic life often did not. But speech in tragedy is not liberation in any simple sense. It is exposure. It makes inner conflict audible. Medea's words in the dramatic tradition have influenced countless later interpretations because they are so difficult to classify. They can sound wounded, intelligent, cold, persuasive, furious, and reflective in rapid succession. Human feeling is rarely tidy, and the myth remembers that. There is also the matter of the gods, who hover around Greek myth with varying degrees of intervention. In some accounts, Medea is linked to divine ancestry or protection. In others, the gods remain distant, and the world seems to operate through vows, kinship, and human choice. This ambiguity is characteristic of mythic narrative. The supernatural does not always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it appears as a family genealogy, a prophecy, a gift from a deity, or an inherited skill. The ancient listener would have sensed that the world was porous. Dreams, omens, birds, weather, sacrificial smoke, and strange coincidences all belonged to a field of meaning where no sharp modern border separated sacred from ordinary. Medea's knowledge may have been interpreted in that older register. She is at once more than human and still very much human, which is another reason she is so unsettling. If one lingers on the geography of the tale, the route from Colchis to Greece becomes a kind of mental map of the known and unknown. The Black Sea region, the Aegean, the Peloponnese, and the isles between them formed not a neat route but a complex maritime world. Ships depended on seasonal patterns and local knowledge. Coasts mattered, harbours mattered, storms mattered. The entire saga of Jason and Medea is built upon seafaring realities that ancient people understood intimately. A voyage might carry cargo, brides, exiles, mercenaries, stories, or prayers. It might also carry rumors from one city to another, allowing tales to spread and become embroidered. In that sense, Medea is not just part of a myth. She is part of the ancient movement of stories across the sea. Archaeology gives us only fragments of the wider world that held these tales. Pottery shards, burial goods, bits of walls, inscriptions worn by weather, a figurine with its face chipped away, a painted scene on a drinking cup. We often know the ancient world through incomplete survival, and that incompleteness leaves room for imagination. Medea's myth, too, survives in fragments and continuities. Some details are lost, some are reshaped, some are hidden in the assumptions of later authors. This makes the story feel almost archaeological in itself. One uncovers a layer, and beneath it another remains. One voice speaks, and beneath it another older voice can still be sensed. There is comfort, oddly enough, in this kind of partial knowledge. It invites patience. It does not demand mastery. The old Greek world was also full of local cults, ritual practices, and regional variations that are easy to forget when myth is told in a smooth, universalized way. Medea's story likely circulated in relation to places where she could be honored, feared, or remembered in specific ways. Ancient hero cults sometimes treated ambiguous figures with a seriousness that modern readers might not expect. A person of myth could become a local presence, attached to a shrine or a family tradition. That means that myth was never only literature. It was also geography, memory, and ritual time. The dead and the legendary were not always neatly separated. Certain names lingered in particular landscapes like weathered inscriptions. Medea may have been discussed as a tragic heroine in one setting, but elsewhere she could be woven into local identity, the way some stories become part of a city's self-understanding. This multiplicity helps explain why she remains so alive. She is too large to be held by one moral summary. Her intelligence cannot be ignored, nor can the injury done to her, nor the harm she causes in return, nor the way later cultures projected onto her their fear of unruly women, foreignness, and vengeance. Yet if the aim is to keep the tone gentle and sleep-ready, then it is enough to let those tensions soften rather than sharpen. Imagine instead the dim edges of an ancient room where someone is grinding herbs. Imagine a small flame. Imagine a clay bowl. Imagine the smell of rosemary, bay, or bitter roots. Imagine a sea breeze moving through a curtained opening. Such images do not solve the myth. They simply return it to the human scale from which it emerged. The ancient household also depended on textile work, weaving, cleaning, storing, fermenting, cooking, and arranging the constant small labors that keep life going. The mythic grandeur of Medea can sometimes obscure these quieter realities. Yet even in her most legendary form, she remains connected to the domestic sphere. The home is where betrayal happens. It is where children live. It is where garments, gifts, and messages are handled. It is where the public order becomes intimate. In many ancient cultures, the home was also the place where women's work formed an unseen infrastructure for the stability of the whole community. To think of Medea within that framework is to see not only a tragic figure, but a woman whose labor and knowledge were fundamental to the life she is later denied. There is a strange, almost tender irony in the way myths often turn helpers into threats after the danger is over. The one who knows the hidden path becomes suspect. The one who secured victory becomes an inconvenient reminder of dependence. Human societies have long preferred to admire assistance retrospectively while forgetting the person who gave it. Medea's story exposes this habit with painful precision. Jason's success is not his alone, and the tale never lets that fact vanish completely. Even in bedtime quiet, that idea has a calm force. It suggests that histories of glory are often built on unacknowledged support, especially from those whose names are most easily pushed to the margins. Myth remembers this in the form of a betrayed woman. The pattern is older than the story and much wider than any single city. The emotional landscape of the tale also includes silence. Silence in the home after a promise has been broken. Silence when a guest leaves and does not return. Silence before a decision becomes irreversible. Ancient tragedies knew the power of what is not said. In many myths, the moment before action carries as much weight as the action itself. Medea's myth has such moments: the calm before recognition, the stillness before choice, the pause in which a life changes shape. These are not dramatic in a noisy way. They are the kind of quiet that can feel heavier than speech. In a dark room at night, they may be easier to imagine than the later violence because they belong to a recognizable human experience. Most lives are altered not by thunder, but by gradually gathering certainty. There is something almost classical in the way the Greek world gave form to grief, not because grief was beautiful, but because art and ritual tried to give it shape so it could be endured. Lament, funeral custom, memorial song, and family remembrance all work together to make loss socially bearable. Medea's story enters that cultural field and turns it inside out. Her grief is not pure innocence. Her grief is mixed with rage, calculation, and the refusal to accept an assigned fate. That mixture can be difficult to hold, which is perhaps why later traditions so often tried to separate out one element and call it the whole. But myths are patient with complexity. They do not require human feeling to be singular. They permit a person to be devastated and dangerous, vulnerable and formidable, wounded and morally opaque. In the wider history of the ancient Mediterranean, movement itself was a constant condition. Merchants, settlers, captives, envoys, pilgrims, artisans, and soldiers crossed waters and borders. Stories about such movement absorbed anxieties about lineage, customs, and marriage. A foreign bride in a Greek city could symbolize the promise of alliance, but also the fear of what is not assimilated. Medea's foreignness is not a decorative feature. It is central to the way the myth works. She is marked as different before her choices become terrifying. That sequence matters. It reveals how communities may turn suspicion into narrative after the fact, making a stranger into a warning. The myth survives partly because it captures this social logic so starkly. And yet there is also wonder here. Greek myth loves extraordinary skill, and Medea possesses it. She knows how to prepare medicines. She knows how to influence outcomes. She knows how to navigate liminal spaces. In a world that still treasured practical wisdom, this would have made her impressive as well as alarming. The ancient Mediterranean had many traditions of healers, seers, midwives, and ritual experts whose authority came from experience rather than office. Their knowledge was often localized, embodied, and difficult to formalize. Medea gathers that kind of authority into a legendary figure. She becomes memorable because she knows how the hidden world works. In the quieter corners of historical imagination, one might think of the materials that surrounded such a figure. Mortars and pestles worn smooth by use, bronze knives, small jars of oil, bundle after bundle of dried leaves, wool dyed deep red or saffron. A household courtyard where sunlight falls in a bright square, a child listening from the edge of an open doorway, a sea captain's cloak hanging by a peg, an incense burner slowly releasing smoke. These images are not in the myth as explicit detail, but they are consonant with it. They allow the story to breathe at human scale. Myth often feels most intimate when placed back among the common objects of ancient life. There is perhaps a quiet sadness in how often women in myth are remembered most vividly when something has gone terribly wrong. That is not unique to Medea, of course, but her case is especially strong because she was never merely passive. She acts decisively, and yet her story is still refracted through the judgments of others. Ancient and later audiences alike have sometimes treated her as an emblem of excess, as if the story's moral lesson were simply that powerful feeling in a woman must be contained. But the tale also asks whether betrayal itself is not a kind of violence that ripples outward. It asks what happens when a promise is treated as disposable. It asks whether the social order is truly stable if it depends on denying the cost paid by those outside its favored circle. Such questions do not need to be answered loudly. They can rest quietly in the mind like a half-remembered dream. The path of mythology often moves from lived experience into symbolic inheritance. What may have begun as local legend, ritual memory, or an ancestral tale becomes part of a larger literary tradition. By the time Medea appears in later classical literature, she has already been shaped by many tellers. Her story becomes one of the great reservoirs of Western imagination. Philosophers, poets, dramatists, painters, and scholars all approach her differently. Some see her as monstrous, some as tragic, some as cunning, some as emancipated, some as proof of patriarchal fear, some as a warning about passion untethered from restraint. The very abundance of interpretation suggests that the myth holds an unusually deep emotional charge. It does not stay still. It keeps opening. It is interesting, in a history of the mind sort of way, how people often return to stories like Medea's when they are trying to think about the boundary between reason and feeling. Her character can be read as the embodiment of a mind that sees too clearly. She understands situations with an almost unbearable precision. Once trust is broken, she knows what follows. That clarity can look like coldness, but it may also be a defense against collapse. In the ancient world where honor, shame, and reputation were woven tightly into public life, betrayal could have consequences that were not merely emotional but existential. To be dishonored might mean to be socially unmade. Medea's response belongs to that world of absolute stakes. Even so, for a bedtime telling, it can help to slow the pace and return to the sensory calm beneath the plot. Think of the ancient night, lamps trimmed low, the small noises of a household settling, a dog lifting its head and then sleeping again, a city gate shut for the evening, out beyond the walls, fields dark and still. Beyond the fields, the route to the harbour. Beyond the harbour, the sea with its patient movement. Ancient people lived under the same sky, watched the same moon, and knew the same daily descent into darkness. Their myths often feel grand, but they were also made in intimate relation to ordinary nightfall. Medea's story, despite its intensity, is part of that same world of lamps and sleep, of whispered conversation and guarded doors. As the tale deepens, one may also notice how much it depends on promises. Oaths in the ancient world were serious things. Sworn words were not merely expressions of intent, they bound people before gods and communities. To break an oath was to fracture the moral order. The myth of Medea is saturated with broken obligations, whether in marriage, hospitality, or loyalty. Ancient audiences would have felt the weight of that. Hospitality in particular was a sacred matter in Greek culture, a code of welcoming and reciprocity that extended across households and lands. When hospitality failed, the failure echoed beyond the immediate persons involved. It suggested disorder at the level of civilization. Medea's story lives in that world of covenant and breach, where the social fabric is fragile enough to be torn by one decisive act. Still, for all its force, the myth is not only about tearing, it is also about persistence. Medea persists in memory. Her name endures because the story she inhabits cannot be comfortably filed away. It continues to ask questions about otherness, intelligence, gender, vengeance, help, and the moral cost of abandonment. Some myths endure because they comfort. Some endure because they warn. Medea endures because she unsettles. That unsettling quality may not seem bedtime soft on the surface, yet there is a strange restfulness in knowing that old stories have always contained difficult truths. The world is not made simpler by denying them. It is made deeper by letting them remain complicated. The ancient Mediterranean itself was a place of layered identities. Greek communities interacted with Phoenician, Anatolian, Egyptian, Persian, and Caucasian worlds through trade, war, migration, and exchange. Objects, motifs, and stories moved along with people. The figure of Medea may carry traces of this broader cultural mixing. Her foreign origin is not merely literary color, it reflects a real ancient experience of contact across languages and customs. In that sense, the myth is also a memory of connectivity. Even the fear of the foreign is evidence of encounter. A closed world would not need to invent such powerful strangers. It is because ancient societies were porous, coastal, and connected that a story like Medea's could arise and travel so widely. If one imagines the myth as a shoreline, then Medea is like a tide line where many kinds of material collect. Driftwood, shells, bits of rope, seaweed, smooth stones, a fragment of something human-made and weathered by water. The tale gathers adventure, domesticity, exile, magic, loyalty, and loss. It also gathers the anxieties of ancient city life, where status could shift, foreigners could be welcomed or feared, and family allegiance could be both sacred and suffocating. The result is a story that feels at once distant and familiar, as if it belonged to a world not quite ours, but built from the same emotional materials. Later literature often made Medea speak with startling brilliance, and that brilliance is part of her survival. She is a character who cannot be reduced to silence by the passage of time. This matters because so many women in the ancient record appear only indirectly, through the words of men, through legal traces, through tombs, through household goods, through representation. Myth gives Medea a voice large enough to outlast the age that created her. That voice is not always kind, but it is unforgettable. To hear it in a quiet room is to sense both beauty and danger. It is like hearing water move in darkness. One cannot always see where it will go, but one knows it is there. And perhaps by now the story has become less a sequence of events than a field of still images. A ship under sail, a woman with herbs, a palace corridor, a child's toy left on the floor, a foreign shoreline, a marriage pledge, a city at dusk, a bronze basin catching reflected firelight. These images can rest without explanation. They do not need to be solved. They can simply accompany the mind as it softens towards sleep. Ancient stories often work that way in the end. Their plots are active, but their afterimages are quiet. If one were to ask what Medea finally offers as a figure of myth, the answer might be something like this. She is a reminder that the ancient world understood how love and betrayal can be woven tightly together, how knowledge can be both gift and burden, how an outsider can expose the hidden fragility of a community, and how a life uprooted from its own land can become impossible to narrate without contradiction. That is a large lesson, but it does not need to be stated harshly. It can arrive as a whisper from very old times. The whisper says that people cross seas for many reasons. They carry hopes, skills, fears, and debts. Sometimes they are welcomed, sometimes they are not. Sometimes the costs of belonging appear only after the doors have already closed. The myth also leaves room for a different kind of curiosity, one that is less about judgment and more about survival. What did Medea know of the plants in her homeland? How were remedies prepared in the ancient eastern regions connected to Greek medicine? What stories were told by women who tended homes far from the cities that wrote the grand histories? What local cults or memories may have preserved a gentler face of the figure later dramatists made terrible? These questions do not have complete answers. That is part of their quiet charm. They invite us to listen to absence as much as to presence. They remind us that history is often made of what has not fully survived. In that sense, Medea's exile is not only hers, it becomes a broader image of all the things that leave traces without remaining whole. A language spoken in one household and forgotten in the next. A song known by a grandmother and then lost. A recipe never written down. A city that no longer exists except in ruins and references. A ship whose wood has returned to the sea. A decision whose consequences are still felt long after the decision-maker is gone. Ancient history is full of such quiet disappearances. Myth, by contrast, has the odd power to make disappearance memorable, so the night can keep moving with her in it softly. There is no need to hurry toward final judgment. The old story can simply remain nearby, like a lamp behind a curtain or a shoreline beyond the dark. Medea, in all her troubling complexity, does not need to be solved before sleep. She can be allowed to be what myths so often are at their deepest, a vessel for old human fears and old human tenderness carried across time, a woman from a distant land, a maker of remedies, a bride on a dangerous journey, a mother in a broken house, a figure at the margin where belonging fails and memory begins. And if the mind is ready to drift now, let it drift past Corinth, past the Aegean, past the long routes of traders and sailors, past the cliffs and harbours and small inland roads, until only the sound of water remains. Let the sea be ancient and unhurried. Let the moon travel over it without explanation. Let the old names become soft shapes in the dark. Let the house settle. Let the hearth cool. Let the herbs dry in their bundles. Let the story stay near, but not too near. In the quiet after all the telling, there is still the gentle fact that the world has always contained sorrow and wonder together, and that even the most troubled myths can become a kind of calm when held with patience. Before the story loosens completely and lets the night take it, it may be comforting to linger a little longer in that older world that gave Medea her first shape. Greek myth does not arrive all at once as a fixed library of tales. It grows through recitation, memory, performance, and local tradition. One city might emphasize one version of a god or hero, while another city remembers a different detail, a different ending, a different genealogy. The myths we know today are often the quiet survivors of many tellings. In that way, Medea belongs not only to one playwright or one poem, but to a wider current of ancient imagination, where stories travelled as lightly and as uncertainly as traders, exiles, and winds. Her name itself feels old, and it is worth hearing slowly. Some ancient names seem to carry an echo of their own meaning, even when scholars cannot fully agree on the root. Medea becomes, in Greek literature, a name that can seem to gather around it ideas of craft, counsel, transformation, and danger. It is not unusual in myth for a name to become larger than any one person. The ancient world often treated names as living things. To know a name could mean to hold some part of a person's essence. To lose a name or to have it spoken wrongly could feel like a small unraveling. In that sense, Medea's own story is one of repeated renaming by later generations, each century laying a fresh layer of meaning over her figure. Long before drama gave her sharp edges, the eastern edges of the Greek imagination were already full of places that sounded distant and rich with marvels. Colchis, her homeland in the mythic geography, lay beyond the familiar Aegean routes at the far shore of the Black Sea. To ancient listeners, that distance mattered. It made her not simply foreign, but far away in a way that invited wonder. The Greeks did not imagine the world as a uniform map. They knew of coastlines, islands, river mouths, empires, mountain passes, and lands where customs changed from valley to valley. The Black Sea itself was a body of water that could feel both connective and perilous. Its winds, currents, and long voyages would have made it a place of trade, rumor, and memory. If a story begins there, it begins in a region already suited to stories of crossing and return, of goods exchanged and identities altered. The Argonauts, too, belong to that old pattern of movement. Their quest for the Golden Fleece is one of the great composite myths of Greek tradition, bringing together heroes from many places. It is a story of gathering, which is itself a gentle contrast to Medea's later isolation. Jason is not alone when he sails. He is surrounded by other famous names, each bringing their own strength and their own fragility. Heracles, Orpheus, Castor, and Polydeuces, and others in some tellings, all make the ship Argo feel like a vessel of legend rather than a simple boat. Ancient tales often love these crowded beginnings. They create the sense that history, or mythic history, is never made by one person alone. Even the lone hero is usually carried by a chorus of companions, gods, and old expectations. And yet, in many memories of the story, the moment that changes everything is intimate, almost hushed. Medea sees Jason or hears of him, and something in the arrangement of the world shifts. This is one of those mythic moments that can sound sudden to the listener, but would have been in ancient dramatic thought the result of many hidden forces. A goddess may be involved, Aphrodite's influence or Eros's arrow, or the old machinery of divine persuasion. Desire in myth is rarely only personal. It is also cosmic. It arrives as a force that can lift and unmake. Ancient people were often comfortable imagining emotion as something with a life of its own, not merely a private feeling, but a power capable of entering houses and nations. Medea's knowledge of potions and rites places her in a long tradition of women in ancient myth and folklore who know things the world does not always know how to honor. She is often described as a pharmakeus, or a woman skilled with pharmaca, a word that can mean medicines, drugs, or magical substances depending on context. That range of meaning is one of those quiet facts that can open a great deal of ancient life. For the Greeks, the line between medicine and magic was not always clean. A healing herb could also poison. A charm could protect or manipulate. A ritual that soothed one person might unsettle another. In a world without modern pharmacology, knowledge of roots, minerals, bark, resins, and seasonal gathering mattered deeply. Some of that knowledge was likely preserved in households, among women in priestly settings, and through practical experience. Myth tends to exaggerate such knowledge into marvel, but the marvel itself may have grown from real familiarity with plants and bodily vulnerability. There is something especially bedtime soft about thinking of the ancient world in these terms, because it reminds us that greatness and mystery often lived beside ordinary, careful acts. A hand crushing leaves, a pot simmering, water cooled for washing, a string tied around a wrist, incense placed on a fire. The people of the Bronze Age, the archaic Greek colonies, the classical cities, and the later Hellenistic kingdoms all lived with materials that were simple and persistent. Grain, oil, wine, wool, salt, honey. The ingredients of daily life change little even as empires rise and fall. Myth dresses them in brilliance, but underneath the brilliance is a steady household world that feels almost timeless. If Medea is remembered as dangerous, it is partly because she is remembered as knowing too much. Ancient stories often treat deep knowledge as both admirable and unsettling. A healer can become a poisoner, a priestess can become a witch, a foreign woman can become a threat simply because she understands what others do not. That fear tells us as much about the societies telling the story as it does about Medea herself. Greek communities, like many ancient societies, were shaped by strong distinctions between insiders and outsiders, citizens and non-citizens, kin and strangers, men and women, free and enslaved. Those distinctions were not always rigid in practice, but they mattered. Myth gave them dramatic form. The quiet sadness at the center of Medea's tale may lie in how thoroughly she becomes an outsider after having once been indispensable. In some versions, she saves Jason by helping him complete the impossible task set before him by her father, King Eetes. She gives him the means to claim the fleece. She betrays her own family, her own homeland, her own social world. In a bedtime telling, one might pause here and feel how strange and human this is. A person can make a choice so enormous that it rearranges the rest of life. One moment, one promise, one act of trust can lead to years of wandering. Ancient audiences would likely have felt the weight of this more strongly than modern readers sometimes do, because family bonds and obligations were a central moral architecture of the world. Medea's choices are therefore not just romantic, they are cosmological in scale. She crosses a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. And yet myths are rarely content to call such crossings simply wrong. They prefer ambiguity. Medea is both helper and betrayer. Jason is both beloved and unworthy. The gods may be patrons or tricksters. The child of an Eastern king becomes the wife of a Greek adventurer, then the rejected foreigner in a Greek city, then the mother whose grief or rage becomes almost unthinkable. Every stage of the story transforms the meaning of the previous one. This is one reason the myth has survived so long. It refuses to sit quietly in one moral category. It keeps opening into new meanings, like a corridor with more rooms than expected. It is also interesting to remember that the ancient Greeks did not tell the story in a vacuum. Their world was one of colonies, trade routes, borrowed knowledge, and encounters with older civilizations. They knew of Egypt, Phoenicia, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the many peoples living around the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Greek myth absorbed and transformed these contacts. Some stories feel like memory of contact itself, though memory made dreamlike. The figure of Medea coming from the East, skilled in powerful knowledge, may preserve faint cultural resonances of that broader ancient exchange. She is not easily reduced to one historical source, but she surely belongs to a world where Greeks imagined the far side of the sea as a place where wisdom and strangeness often met. The later association of Medea with Thessaly is also worth letting settle softly into the mind. Thessaly, with its plains and mountains, had its own mythic reputation. It was a land of horses in many ancient imaginings and of rugged regional identities. In some versions, Medea's presence there links her to the older, more rustic and sometimes more savage corners of Greek mythology. She is not only a foreigner from the Black Sea, she becomes someone who moves through the Greek landscape itself, entering cities, households, and royal lines. Her exile is therefore not simply geographic. It is social and psychological. She is within Greek space and yet never fully of it. The notion of exile in antiquity carries a particular quiet gravity. To be exiled was not merely to be moved somewhere else. It meant the interruption of identity. A person might lose property, status, legal protection, and the familiar rhythms of daily life. Ancient cities had elaborate feelings about belonging. A citizen body could be proud and small, a kind of enclosed world within walls and laws. To be excluded from it could mean living in a prolonged uncertainty. Medea, as mythic exile, embodies that uncertainty with exquisite cruelty. She is never fully settled anywhere after the first departure. Even when she is protected, she remains in motion. In this way, the myth reflects a reality common throughout antiquity. The world was full of displaced people. Wars, dynastic marriages, colonization, piracy, debt, and changing political fortunes sent families wandering from one place to another. There is a kind of calm in recognizing that ancient people knew displacement intimately. They knew the feeling of reaching a new shore and not knowing what would be found there. They knew the trouble of finding water, of locating a hearth, of relying on strangers' hospitality. Hospitality itself was a sacred bond in the Greek world, often called xenia. The exchange of gifts, shelter, and protected status between host and guest was meant to create trust across distance. Jason's story, viewed through this lens, becomes even more layered because Medea's assistance depends on trust, and her later rejection is a kind of profound violation of the bonds that once united them. Ancient listeners would have recognized the stakes of this. Hospitality was not a casual courtesy. It was a moral institution, watched over by Zeus himself in many traditions. In some versions of the tale, Medea helps Jason because she has been promised marriage and honor. In others, divine compulsion is stronger than her own will. These differences matter less than the underlying pattern. She invests herself in a future that turns against her. That pattern is old and it can feel almost painfully familiar. Human beings often build futures on stories told by others. They trust in promises because there is no other way to live. Ancient myth, for all its strangeness, never forgets this. It understands the vulnerability at the heart of hope. The more grand the destiny, the more fragile the person living inside it. The golden fleece itself is one of those objects that feels both luxurious and slightly unreal, as if it were meant to shimmer at the edge of perception. Gold in the ancient imagination could represent wealth, sanctity, kingship, and the difficult value of things that cannot be held easily. A fleece, by contrast, suggests sheep, agriculture, pastoral life, softness, and labor. Putting them together creates a lovely contradiction, something familiar and domestic made extraordinary by the color of treasure. The fleece might be read as a symbol of legitimacy, but also of the way power often hides itself in objects that seem simple until one sees the ambitions surrounding them. Ancient myths loved such paradoxes. A crown can be heavy because of gold, but also because of history. A garment can be beautiful because it was made by hand, then made dangerous by the wishes attached to it. One could think, too, of the sea routes that made such stories imaginable. The Greeks of the archaic and classical periods sailed widely. They founded colonies, traded pottery and oil and wine, and encountered cultures far older than their own city-state traditions. The sea connected them to Egypt, where temple traditions were ancient and monumental, and to the Levant, where alphabetic scripts and mercantile networks flourished. It connected them to Anatolia, a landscape of kingdoms and river valleys, and to the Black Sea shores, where grain and metals and fish moved through ports and river mouths. Myth is not a map, but it sometimes preserves the emotional texture of real connectivity. Jason's voyage has the shape of long-distance exchange turned into quest. Medea's journey has the shape of migration turned into tragedy. The myth also invites a very old question: what does it mean to belong to a place? In ancient societies, belonging could be tied to ancestry, land, rights, language, and law. It could also be fragile, negotiated, or denied. Medea belongs to Colchis by birth, to Jason by marriage, to certain powers by knowledge, and to no city for long. This unstable belonging is part of her power as a mythic figure. She becomes a kind of negative example and also a mirror. The more culture insists on clean boundaries, the more myth seems drawn to crossing them. Medea crosses kinship boundaries, national boundaries, moral boundaries, and even the boundary between healer and destroyer. Some of the oldest surviving literature surrounding her comes to us through fragmentary remains and later summaries, which gives the figure an additional veil of distance. Ancient texts do not always arrive as complete, polished wholes. They can be incomplete papyrus scraps, quoted lines in later authors, scholia, summaries in compendia, or archaeological traces of libraries long gone. This partial survival is fitting for myth. We know Medea as one knows a distant mountain through clouds. The shape is there, but not every contour. There is a beauty in that uncertainty. It slows the mind. It resists the false comfort of total clarity. Sleep, too, often begins in that softened state, where details loosen and the edges of certainty become less sharp. If one follows the story after Jason's betrayal, the path darkens, but even the darkness can be viewed with a kind of ancient stillness. Medea's response in the later tradition is often catastrophic, yet one can also see the tragic machinery around her. Greek tragedy is interested not merely in personal character, but in the pressure of circumstance, the collision of pride, shame, desire, obligation, and divine suggestion. The house of Jason and Medea becomes a stage on which public and private life collapse into each other. Children are not only children, they are dynastic future. Marriage is not only marriage, it is alliance. Exile is not only a legal status, it is social death. Such layers are characteristic of ancient drama. The domestic sphere is never simply domestic. The hearth can be the center of a city's moral order. The figure of the hearth is especially gentle to contemplate now. In ancient Greek homes, the hearth was more than a place for warmth. It was a focal point of the household, linked to Hestia, the quiet goddess of domestic order and stable flame. Hestia does not command the dramatic attention of Athene or Aphrodite, but she represents something essential and easy to overlook: the persistence of interior life. A house stays a house partly because of a fire kept in its center. In stories like Medea, the hearth is often disrupted, symbolically if not always literally. Once the center fails, all the rooms of meaning grow cold. It is a sorrowful but also strangely delicate way to understand the myth. What happens when the place meant to hold a family instead becomes a site of rupture? What happens when the fire that should warm becomes unable to soothe? The ancient world knew many kinds of female figures who stood near the edge of ordinary household life. Goddesses, witches, prophetesses, midwives, mourners, nurses, and mothers all occupied zones where the seen and unseen touched. Medea belongs to that borderland. She is often read through the lens of danger, but she can also be seen as a dramatized form of female intelligence that refuses containment. Ancient male authors were sometimes fascinated by women whose speech, skill, or emotional force could not be neatly subordinated. Myth gave that fascination a body. Medea speaks, reasons, persuades, mourns, and retaliates. She is not silent. In a world where many women's lives left few direct records, such a figure may have seemed at once threatening and compelling precisely because she was so articulate. It is also worth remembering that mythic women frequently act within systems that limit their choices. Marriage arrangements, inheritance rules, citizen rights, and household expectations all shape the lives of real ancient women in different ways across time and place. While myth exaggerates and transforms, it often reveals the emotional architecture of those constraints. Medea's choices are extreme, but the sense of being used, moved, abandoned, or silenced would not have been unfamiliar to many listeners, even if their own lives were far less dramatic. Stories can make visible what ordinary life conceals. They can also turn private suffering into public memory. There is an old and subtle sadness in how often societies remember powerful women as monstrous when those women have crossed from helper to obstacle. Medea's legendary intelligence becomes suspect the moment it no longer serves the hero's household. This is not unique to her. Ancient literature is full of figures whose gifts become accusations. Knowledge, beauty, eloquence, and independence can all be turned into evidence against a person. Myth tends to compress these contradictions into a single unforgettable shape. The result is a figure who can be feared, pitied, admired, and condemned all at once. That is not a weakness of the myth. It is one of its deepest strengths. If one were to imagine the quieter domestic moments inside the story, the picture changes. One could think of garments folded in a chest, of a child sleeping, of ordinary meals in earthen vessels, of servants moving through a courtyard, of a woman looking toward the road with the particular stillness of someone measuring time by departures that have not yet fully become departures. Ancient houses were often made of perishable materials, and their interiors would have held smells of smoke, oil, wool, and stored grain. Such sensory details are not decorative. They remind us that even the grandest myths took place against the backdrop of ordinary life. The house of tragedy was also a house of weathered walls, cracked pottery, baskets, sandals, and bread. The ancient imagination often paired far travel with homecoming, and Medea's story is especially poignant because homecoming is denied or transformed. Many Greek myths revolve around nostos, the return home after wandering, most famously in the Odyssey. Medea's trajectory is different. She does not return to a happy home. She leaves one world behind and never regains a place that fully restores her. Her exile becomes a kind of anti-homecoming. This contrast with Odysseus's return helps clarify what is unusual about her mythic role. Odysseus is celebrated for outwitting dangers and finally reclaiming place. Medea, by contrast, becomes the one for whom no return can heal. Her story is therefore colder, stranger, and perhaps more modern in feeling, though it is very ancient indeed. Yet even in this harshness, the myth remains saturated with the language of roads, ships, thresholds, and passage. Ancient people understood thresholds as meaningful places. Doorways, harbour entrances, city gates, and boundary stones all carried symbolic force. They marked the space between safety and risk. Medea appears again and again at such crossings. She comes over the sea. She enters a foreign house. She moves from wife to exile. She passes from assistance to estrangement. Myth loves these liminal states because they reveal what stable categories cannot. A person on a threshold is never entirely one thing or another. That is why such figures stay with us. They embody transition itself. The Black Sea world from which Medea comes also invites a little more quiet contemplation. Ancient Greek contacts around the Pontic region were extensive and complex. Colonies dotted the coasts, local peoples shaped trade and resistance, and later empires layered new forms of rule over older networks. The sea was not merely a blank expanse between Greek centers and a distant periphery. It was a lived environment, full of routes, seasonal conditions, and exchanges of goods and stories. Grain from the north sustained cities elsewhere. Fish, timber, metals, hides, and slaves moved through these circuits. When myth situates Medea there, it places her in a world of exchange that was materially real, even if the story itself is marvelous. Her migration is thus not only the movement of a fantastical princess, but the poetic reflection of a connected ancient basin. The same can be said, in a softer way, about the role of enchantment in the tale. Enchantment is one of the oldest literary ways of expressing influence. To be enchanted is to be changed by something that bypasses ordinary explanation. Ancient people knew many forms of influence that did not require magical language to feel mysterious: persuasion, music, grief, charisma, fear, reputation. But myth concentrates these into charms, spells, and divine interventions. Medea's arts therefore become a heightened version of a universal human reality. We all live among influences we do not fully control. Some are beautiful. Some are dangerous. Some are both. The myth simply makes that condition visible. Perhaps that is why Medea remains such a memorable figure across centuries. She is not just a villain or a victim. She is a concentration of many old tensions between foreignness and belonging, knowledge and taboo, love and calculation, household and exile, human choice and divine pressure. In one sense, she is singular. In another, she is a vessel into which many stories of the ancient Mediterranean can be poured. She is part of the long history of women in myth who stand at the edge of what a culture can comfortably imagine. She is also part of the history of migration, where a person's identity is altered by movement across water and law and language. Those histories are ancient, and they remain quietly contemporary. The more one sits with her, the more the story seems to spread outward into neighboring rooms of thought. One room holds the archaic age, with its epic singers and local aristocracies. Another holds the classical theatre, where audiences in stone seats listen to tragedies about family, city, and divine justice. Another contains Hellenistic scholarship, where learned editors gathered variant versions of myths and catalogued genealogies with patient care. Another still opens into Roman reception, when writers like Ovid shaped Medea into a figure of eloquence and anguish for a different empire. Still later rooms contain medieval moralizations, Renaissance revivals, operatic transformations, and modern reinterpretations that see in her the pain of exile, colonization, gendered rage, or racial otherness. It is a very old story, but it keeps changing its costume. And yet beneath all those later layers, the oldest feeling remains simple. A person leaves home and cannot quite return. The home that remains behind is altered by the leaving. The new place is not fully kind. The heart does not settle. This is not unusual in life, and perhaps that is why myth can hold it so well. The ancient world had no shortage of figures who travelled under pressure. Refugees, brides, captives, ambassadors, merchants, mercenaries, sailors, and pilgrims all crossed boundaries with hopes that were sometimes fulfilled and sometimes not. Medea's grandeur lets us sense the emotional cost of such journeys in a distilled form. If there is any peace to be found in her exile, it may lie not in resolving the tragedy, but in acknowledging the breadth of human experience she gathers. Ancient myths do not only preserve violence, they also preserve longing, tenderness, intelligence, craft, and the stubborn attempt to make meaning from loss. Medea's figure, though shadowed, is full of these qualities. She is one of those mythic presences who seem to hold more than they can safely say. The ancient storytellers may have intended warning or astonishment or moral disturbance, but time has added another effect. Her story has become a quiet chamber in the memory of civilization, a place where old questions continue to breathe. And so the night can keep unfolding around her without alarm. The sea remains dark and patient. The cities of old Asia Minor and Greece soften into distance. The columns, the harbours, the palace walls, and the slave quarters all recede into a common twilight of memory. Even the names of the heroes become gentler when they are no longer spoken in contest. Jason, Aeetes, Creon, Glauce, Hecate, Hestia, the Argonauts, and the rest can drift like half-remembered stars. Medea herself can stand in that fading light not only as a figure of ruin, but as a sign of how ancient stories keep the human heart awake long after the body wishes to rest. Perhaps the most restful way to think of her now is as a voice carried over water. Not a shout, not a verdict, just a voice. The ancient world was full of voices that survive only in fragments, in quotations, in papyrus torn by time, in the commentary of later scholars, in myths reshaped by poets who never expected to be the last to tell them. Medea's voice in all its versions travels among those remnants. It comes to us across distance, carrying the salt of old seas and the scent of unfamiliar herbs. It is a difficult voice, but not an empty one. It reminds us that the past is never entirely silent. It only speaks more softly as we learn to listen. And when the listening is gentle enough, the story no longer needs to move with urgency. It can simply hover, a ship on still water, a doorway after sunset, a bundle of plants drying in a shaded room, a child's sleep, a house with its lamp turned low, a foreign shore scene from far out at sea, a woman standing at the margin of an old kingdom, neither fully inside nor fully gone. The myth can remain there, quiet and unfinished, as many ancient things are. The mind may rest beside it. The breath may deepen. The old world may sink into a softer darkness where sorrow and wonder are no longer in conflict, but fold into one another like waves meeting the shore. And in that softer darkness, it is interesting to remember that Greek myth rarely gives us exile as a single event. It comes as a sequence of departures, each one making the next more probable. A person is welcomed, then mistrusted. A foreign skill is admired, then feared. A useful stranger becomes an inconvenient presence. This pattern appears often in the stories of the ancient Mediterranean, where city-states prized hospitality and yet worried over outsiders with remarkable persistence. The old word xenia, that sacred guest friendship, could shine like gold in ideal form, while in practice the bond was delicate, political, and easily strained. Medea's life moves through this tension almost everywhere she goes. She is received when she is helpful. She is excluded when she becomes difficult to contain. The pattern is not only dramatic, it is very old. It belongs to the ordinary history of borders. The ancient world knew many kinds of border. There were the visible ones, such as rivers, mountain passes, and harbors. There were also social borders, drawn around kinship, language, marriage, and civic belonging. A person could cross one boundary and still remain outside another. Medea's story lingers in that middle space, where she is neither purely home nor purely exile. This is part of why her tale feels so unsettling. It does not give us the neat comfort of complete belonging or complete banishment. She is often in transit even while she is standing still. The palace is not her own. The land is never quite hers. The city becomes a stage on which she is seen, judged, and then moved along. If we let the myth become quiet enough, we can notice how much of it is made from domestic things. Not only crowns, oaths, and kings, but also beds, cloth, doors, and the careful preparation of substances. Ancient storytelling often places great power in ordinary objects because daily life itself was the foundation of the world. A woman grinding herbs in a mortar, a servant carrying water, a chamber sealed against the night, a garment folded and laid out, a vessel set aside for a sacred use. These details belong to the same texture as empire and heroism. Medea's craft is especially tied to this domestic sphere, even when the effects of her knowledge reach outward into political catastrophe. Her intelligence is practical and intimate. She knows the grain of things. She knows what bleeds, what burns, what soothes, what poisons, what persuades. In later imagination, that knowledge becomes threatening. In older imagination, it may have seemed uncanny, but also profoundly useful, like a craft half-shared between the human and divine. The ancient Greeks were not alone in associating women's knowledge with healing and danger together. In Mesopotamian texts, in Egyptian magical practice, and in later Roman traditions, the wise use of plants could be medical, ritual, and protective at once. A single herb might be an incense, a remedy, a charm, or a toxin depending on context. The line between pharmacy and sorcery was not always drawn where modern readers expect it. Medea inhabits precisely this blurred edge. She belongs to the old category of the pharmakon, a word that can mean medicine, poison, or spell. That double nature is one reason she remains so compelling. She is not merely destructive. She is a reminder that power in the ancient world was often ambiguous, and that ambiguity itself could be feared. There is also a deeper stillness in the way her story touches the landscape of Colchis, the far eastern shore where Greek imagination placed wonders at the edge of the known world. The Greeks had a habit of turning distant regions into places of marvel. Beyond the Aegean, beyond familiar island chains, beyond the routes of regular trade, they imagined lands where rivers ran with extraordinary force, where treasures were guarded by beasts, where strange customs prevailed, and where the boundaries between history and legend grew thin. Colchis was one such place. It stood not just at the edge of geography, but at the edge of Greek certainty. To travel there in myth was to enter a region of mixed identity, where Greek sailors encountered local power, foreign royalty, and a princess whose gifts could alter the fate of heroes. The story is ancient, but the feeling is still recognizable. The known world always seems to end in mystery. Some of the oldest civilizations understood the lure of the distant East in ways that are easy to forget when reading Greek myths only through the lens of later Europe. For the Greeks, eastward journeys carried associations of luxury, danger, old kingdoms, and unfamiliar ritual. Long before the classical period, the Eastern Mediterranean had already been a crowded corridor of exchange. Timber, metals, textiles, ivory, perfumes, and ideas moved by sea and by caravan. Scripts crossed regions and changed shape. Gods acquired new names. Myths traveled as well, often without passports. Medea's story belongs to this older world of circulation. She is not simply a character invented inside a sealed Greek culture. She is shaped by contact zones, by the meeting of Hellenic storytelling with Caucasian, Anatolian, and Near Eastern horizons. Even if later poets exaggerate and simplify, the edges of those exchanges remain visible like lines in a palimpsest. The Golden Fleece itself has the luminous unreality of a treasure story, yet it may also preserve very old memories of wealth and technique. Sheep's wool, especially if handled in certain ways, can catch fine particles of gold from mountain streams. Ancient readers and modern scholars alike have long noticed this possible practical background. A fleece dipped in a river could hold shining grains after washing. If so, the myth might preserve the memory of a real mining practice transformed into wonder. The world of legend often begins with humble mechanisms and then enlarges them until they gleam. What begins as labor becomes enchantment. What begins as extraction becomes quest. This is one of the quiet pleasures of myth. It lets old techniques wear the costume of radiance, and yet the radiance is never without cost. Jason's voyage is usually told as heroic adventure, but the myth carries a hidden ledger. Every prize is obtained by risk, manipulation, and violence. Every arrival depends on somebody's departure. The Argonauts are celebrated sailors, but they are also intruders moving through waters already known by others. They enter a world of kingship, kinship, and obligation not as neutral visitors, but as claimants. Medea's role in helping them is therefore never just personal romance. It is political and existential. She betrays her father, or at least her father's authority, and joins the stranger. That act makes her the engine of the tale, and in many versions, the person most exposed to its consequences. Myth loves to dramatize such crossings because they reveal the fragility of allegiance. The heart can move before the law has finished speaking. It is worth pausing with the ancient atmosphere around oaths, because oaths in Greek culture were not casual promises. They were spoken with the expectation that gods were listening. Zeus himself, in many forms of Greek thought, was guardian of sworn agreement. An oath could stabilize marriage, alliance, friendship, and public trust. To break it was not merely to disappoint another person. It was to enter a moral weather system that might return in punishment later in this life or the next. Medea's story is steeped in broken oaths. Jason's betrayal is personal, but it is also religious in atmosphere. That is partly why the story feels so severe. It is not only about wounded feeling, it is about the collapse of a sacred bond in a society that depended on such bonds to hold fragile communities together. Still, if we remain with the story gently, we can see that the old poets were not only interested in blame. They were interested in thresholds, the threshold between youth and adulthood, between stranger and spouse, between household and exile, between the magical and the civic. Medea stands on nearly all of them. In some versions, she arrives with the freshness of a young woman making irreversible choices. In others, she appears already marked by divine favor, by special vision, by a strange and inherited force. Her uncle or aunt, depending on the lineage given, may have gods in the background of her family tree. Such divine associations are never far away in Greek myth. They make the characters feel less like isolated individuals and more like nodes in a vast, interlaced pattern where human actions are always shadowed by older powers. The goddess Hecate, in particular, hovers around Medea's world with quiet intensity. Hecate is not always loud in the sources, but her presence is unmistakable. She belongs to crossroads, thresholds, night, and the liminal places where roads meet and decisions are made. Her sphere includes magic, ghosts, and the edges of domestic protection. Later Hellenistic and Roman imaginations often gave her torches, dogs, and a haunting triple form, but even in earlier layers she stands near boundaries. Medea's association with her suggests not simple wickedness, but a kind of nocturnal competence. She moves among places where ordinary daylight rules are less secure. The moon itself often seems to belong to this atmosphere. Ancient watchers of the sky could notice the moon's phases with intimate regularity, yet it always retained an element of the uncanny. It governed tides, calendars, and timing, but it also appeared and vanished with the softness of breath. To imagine Medea under moonlight is to place her within one of antiquity's oldest symbols of changeable power. There is something almost tender in the way ancient texts preserve names of plants and substances, even when the magical use of those substances is fantastical. Saffron, poppy, hellebore, acanthus, laurel, bay, roots, barks, resins, and flowers recur through Greek and later literature. Some carried associations with healing, sleep, grief, purification, or divine favor. Others were dangerous in precise and memorable ways. A reader moving slowly through these names can feel the ancient world becoming botanical. Landscapes were not just scenery, they were pharmacies, altars, kitchens, and graveyards all at once. Medea, as a figure of enchantment, belongs to this herbal imagination. Her knowledge is not abstract. It is rooted. It comes from earth, water, and season. Her powers may terrify, but they are also the powers of material attention, the sort of attention that notices which leaf unfurls first after rain, or how a root changes color when cut. Ancient medicine itself lived close to such observations. In the Hippocratic tradition, later codified but drawing on older habits of thought, illness was often linked to balance, air, diet, and place. Treatments were practical, seasonal, and cautious, yet popular imagination still kept company with magic. The boundary between the physician and the sorcerer could be porous in the minds of ordinary people. A healer might be admired for wisdom and suspected for hidden knowledge. Medea embodies that suspicion. She is not a physician, but she stands near the same mystery. How can matter be made to change state, and how much of that change belongs to art rather than to divine intervention? In a premodern world, where explanation was layered rather than separated into disciplines, this question did not have to be solved to remain alive. And perhaps it is a mercy that the myth leaves some things unsolved. The lost Colchian princess of story is not recoverable in a clean historical form. We cannot step behind the poem and find a single original Medea waiting there, untouched. What we can find are traces, hints of older rites, possible echoes of priestly roles, speculations about local women with ritual expertise, remnants of maritime contact across the Black Sea region. Then the poets come in and the figure becomes larger than the evidence. This is often how myth works. History provides the bones, but imagination gives them movement. The body of the tale then travels for centuries, taking on new faces, new ethical meanings, and new emotional weather. If one were to imagine the ancient harbour where such stories might be exchanged, it would likely be busy in daylight and very quiet at dawn. Barges, fishing boats, merchant vessels, and small oared craft would come and go. Nets would glisten. Amphorae would be stacked under awnings. Salt fish, oil, wine, wool, and grain would be counted and recounted. Somewhere nearby, a traveller from inland could arrive with news from another realm entirely. This is the sort of setting where myth becomes plausible. A sailor hears of a foreign princess. A merchant repeats a tale about a land beyond the sea. A poet gathers these fragments and makes them sing. Medea's story, in its movement from Colchis to Iolcus to Corinth and beyond, seems to pass through exactly such channels of retelling. It is a myth made of ships, but also of conversation. Conversation itself is one of the most human things in the story. Medea argues, pleads, deceives, reflects, and finally speaks with a terrible clarity that has made later readers uneasy. Her speeches in tragedy especially are not the speech of a silent monster. They are speeches of a person who understands the structure of her own situation. This is part of the tragedy. She can name what is happening to her, and naming does not save her. The social world around her is stronger than truth alone. That is a sobering thought, but a quiet one. Many ancient stories understand that insight without ever needing to announce it. Wisdom does not always prevent suffering. Sometimes it only makes suffering articulate. The ancient stage itself, where Euripides gives her one of her most enduring forms, was a place of strange calm and public intensity together. A festival crowd under open sky, masked actors, a chorus commenting in measured song, the architecture of stone seating and shared attention. To witness tragedy in Athens was to participate in civic self-reflection. Medea's pain was not private entertainment. It was part of a collective meditation on household, gender, foreignness, and the limits of justice. That context helps explain why the play mattered so much. It was not simply telling a sensational story. It was asking an audience to sit with the danger of what happens when the vulnerable are made to carry the cost of betrayal. In the dimness after the performance, the city might have felt a little less certain of itself, yet the myth is older than Euripides and wider than Athens. Before tragedy fixed her in one unforgettable shape, Medea may have traveled through song, local legend, and oral memory in forms we can no longer fully reconstruct. This is true of many mythic figures. Their earliest voices are lost, but their later echoes are still audible. The loss itself is a kind of archaeological quiet. Broken pottery, worn inscriptions, and damaged texts remind us that civilization is not a complete archive. It is a field of surviving fragments. The silence around Medea's pre-tragic past is not a gap that needs to be filled all at once. It is part of the atmosphere. A missing beginning can make the rest of the story feel more like a dream remembered after waking. There is also the matter of her children, who in later versions become central to the horror. Children in myth often function as both inheritance and vulnerability. They are the future made visible, and therefore they can symbolize what is most precious and most easily damaged. In a household economy, children represented continuity, labor, lineage, and honor. To imagine their destruction was to imagine the breaking of the family line at its most intimate point. That is one reason the tale remains so difficult. It does not let us keep tragedy at a safe distance. It enters the room of the household and sits there quietly, as if listening to everything we thought was secure. The ancient Greeks, who valued the oikos as the basic unit of life, would have recognized the depth of that wound immediately. And yet even here, the story continues to resist simplification. Later traditions reinterpret the children's fate, and some older versions differ enough to remind us that myth is not a single frozen object. It is a stream with many channels. Some tellings make the children victims of Medea's hand, others place responsibility elsewhere or shift the emotional focus. Different cities may have preferred different versions because stories, like cults, often reveal local values. This flexibility is one of the most fascinating things about ancient narrative. A myth can be both stable and unstable, both cherished and contested. It survives by changing. That too is a kind of exile, though a literary one. The story never lives in exactly the same home twice. The geography of Medea's movement also invites a calmer reflection on the Black Sea itself, that broad inland sea known to the Greeks as the Pontos Euxanos, the hospitable sea, though the name is a graceful inversion of its earlier reputation as the inhospitable one. The irony of naming is itself a beautiful ancient habit. To call danger hospitable does not make it safe, but it can soften fear into ritual courtesy. The Black Sea region was and remains a frontier between empires, languages, and ecological zones. In antiquity, it linked Greek colonies with Scythian, Colchian, and many other communities. The coastlines supported trade, agriculture, fishing, and settlement, while inland routes connected to wider networks reaching toward the Caucasus and beyond. Medea's origin at that edge lets the myth carry the atmospheric truth of a border sea, reflective, mysterious, commercially vital, and always more than one culture can fully own. The sea in Greek myth is rarely merely a surface. It is a force of passage, separation, and memory. Sailors learned to read it the way farmers read fields and shepherds read weather. Currents, winds, and seasonal patterns shaped lives long before charts and engines. The stories of return Nostos depend on this deep knowledge. Jason's voyage is not only a heroic expedition, but a passage through a maritime world where survival requires skill, timing, and luck. Medea's own displacements depend on the same waters. Even her later exile by sea from Corinth to Athens in some tellings extends the nautical logic of the story. Water keeps taking her from one arrangement of life to another. The sea does not accuse, it simply carries. One can linger on the contrast between sea and house because that contrast is important in Greek imagination. The sea is open, dangerous, and mobile. The house is enclosed, ordered, and ancestral. Yet the myths repeatedly show how the sea enters the house through marriage, gift exchange, arrival, and betrayal. Medea is both sea-born in narrative and housebound in tragedy. She is the foreign current flowing into civic space. Her presence unsettles the domestic calm that a city like Corinth might wish to preserve. In that sense, she represents not only an individual but a social fear, that the household, once open to the stranger, can never remain untouched by what arrives. The old city of Corinth itself was a place well suited to such a story. Positioned on the narrow land bridge between the Peloponnese and mainland Greece, it was a city of movement and exchange, a place where goods and people crossed with unusual frequency. Its harbours connected it to both eastern and western routes. Its prosperity made it ambitious. Its reputation in later periods was complex, rich, and sometimes morally charged in literary memory. To place Medea, there is to place her in a city already structured by transit. She is exiled into a place that knows the logic of passage, commerce, and interruption. Even the landscape of the city seems to understand that nothing stays fixed forever, and perhaps that is why her story remains so resonant with readers who have never seen the ancient world except through texts and ruins. Most human beings, in one way or another, know what it is to live between places. Some have moved by choice, others by necessity. Some have lost a language, a neighborhood, a family arrangement, or a former self. Exile does not always wear the grand costume of myth. Sometimes it is quiet and mundane. A school closed, a war started, a job changed, a marriage ended, a border crossed, a friendship broken, a life reassembled in partial pieces. Medea's story magnifies this condition until it becomes elemental, but the underlying feeling is common. That commonness may be the source of the myth's slow endurance. The ancient Greeks also understood, perhaps more than we sometimes remember, that grief can sharpen intelligence. Sorrow can clarify. Loss can strip away ornament and leave speech bare. Medea's voice in tragedy is often exact in this way. It does not wander. It sees the structures around her with painful precision. That precision may be part of what frightens others in the story. An injured person who can still think clearly becomes difficult to dismiss. The myth knows this. It gives her words the force of a knife, but also the cold stillness of diagnosis. Such clarity is not comfort. Yet in the night, when one is already half asleep, there is something almost restful about an emotion that knows what it is. Confusion is heavier than sorrow. Medea is not confused. The long afterlife of her story also suggests how myths become containers for changing cultural anxieties. In antiquity, she could be a foreign sorceress, a betrayed wife, a dangerous woman, a grieving mother, a helper of heroes, or a politically charged outsider. In later periods, she could become an emblem of learned magic, a figure of Renaissance fascination, an operatic storm, an Enlightenment problem of reason and passion, a romantic figure of sublime suffering, or a modern symbol of colonial and gendered violence. Each age reclothed her in its own concerns, yet this changing wardrobe never completely hides the older body underneath. The body is still there, a woman from the edge of the map, carrying knowledge, loss, and force into places that do not know what to do with her. There is a quiet beauty in that continuity of reimagining. Civilization does not preserve stories like glass cases preserve artifacts. It tends to touch them, polish them, misuse them, and finally return them to circulation. A myth survives because it can be reread by people who are living through different pressures. Medea's Exile has become a vessel for reflections on migration, the violence of patriarchy, the place of the outsider, the moral ambiguity of revenge, and the cost of demanding that a person remain useful while denying her dignity. All of those readings are later, but they are not necessarily false. Myth is spacious enough to hold them. Ancient stories often become more than their original context, and that is one reason they continue to accompany us at night. If we imagine her in a chamber of the mind, we might not place her at the center of a great blaze or an act of loud rupture. We might instead place her near a window. Outside, the sea is dim. Inside, a lamp burns low. On the table are small objects, a comb, a cup, a folded fabric, a bundle of herbs tied with thread, perhaps a knife with a plain handle. Nothing in the room need be dramatic. The tension of the myth can rest inside the stillness. In that setting, Medea is not only a figure of catastrophe, she is also a keeper of thresholds, a witness to how private sorrow can harden into public consequence. The room feels ancient because human rooms have always held such feelings. It is useful, too, to remember how much the ancient Mediterranean depended on seasons that shaped travel. Sailing was never simply a matter of wanting to go. Winds, storms, and favorable months determined routes. Winter seas could be perilous. The very possibility of departure was thus linked to astronomy, weather, and practical knowledge. This seasonal discipline gave the ancient world a rhythm of waiting. A voyage delayed was common. A crossing was never entirely guaranteed. Medea's life, interpreted through this lens, is full of forced timings. She leaves when she must, not when the calendar feels kind. Such forced movement is one of the oldest forms of suffering. It is quieter than battle, but often more enduring. The myth also preserves the unsettling intimacy of gift exchange. Jason's marriage, in many versions, is itself a kind of social transaction. Medea helps him obtain what he seeks, and in return she expects fidelity, status, and a new place in the world. The failure of that exchange is not only romantic disappointment, it is a breakdown of reciprocal obligation. Ancient societies often organized relations through gifts, dowries, guest friendship, and honor debts. When those systems failed, the emotional fallout was immense. Medea's story can therefore be read, with great gentleness, as a myth about what happens when reciprocity collapses and one person is left carrying the weight of a deal that others no longer honor. The pain is old and very human. And then there is Athens, that later refuge in some versions, where Medea finds another chapter of vulnerability. Athens in the 5th century BCE liked to imagine itself as a city of laws, rhetoric, theatre, and civic identity, yet its self-image depended on exclusions as well. Women, foreigners, slaves, and many resident outsiders occupied constrained positions within the polis. Medea's arrival there in myth highlights that tension beautifully. She is useful, protected, and still not fully at home. Even in a city that prized order and reason, she remains a reminder that belonging can be conditional. The myth in this phase becomes a meditation on the limits of asylum. A place can offer shelter and still not offer peace. That is perhaps why the story feels so modern at moments, not because it is modern, but because the human problems it gathers have not disappeared. People still arrive in new places with memories no one else can see. They still try to secure a life through fragile trust. They still discover that love, law, and survival do not always align. Medea's exile is therefore not only a mythic punishment, it is a lens on the condition of living among others. The story asks what happens when the bonds meant to protect turn instead into instruments of harm. It asks what remains of a self when the world's promises are withdrawn. These are not questions with easy endings, and so the myth endures. The ancient poets, of course, did not always write with the intention of psychological realism. They were also making pattern, rhythm, and memory, but the result often exceeds intention. A well-told myth can reveal emotional truth even when it is built from marvels. Medea's life is full of impossible things, yet the feeling inside it is recognizable. She knows what it means to be indispensable and disposable at once. She knows the pain of being valued for what she can do, not for who she is. She knows the terrible temptation to answer injury with symmetry. Those are old emotions. They belong to courts and kitchens, to empires and households, to the human heart itself. If the night is especially quiet, one might imagine hearing the smaller sounds of antiquity that surround the story: the scrape of sandals on stone, water being poured from a jug into a basin, a distant market awning flapping in wind, a servant sweeping a threshold, a horse shifting in its stall, the low crack of a lamp. These sounds do not belong to one century alone. They recur wherever people live, in walls and open to the weather. Medea's myth passes among such sounds like a shadow moving under a door. It is not always visible, but it is present in the atmosphere. There is, finally, a kind of mercy in allowing myths to remain partly unresolved. We do not need to decide every question about Medea to feel what her story carries. We do not need to choose between witch, victim, mother, foreign princess, or avenger, as if one label could complete the other. The figure is larger when allowed to remain mixed. That mixture is itself an ancient truth. The past was never simple, and the stories that have survived from it are rarely simple either. They move like layered water, reflecting different skies at once. To follow Medea quietly is to accept that a person can be many things at once, and that exile can sharpen rather than erase those many things. So the myth can continue to recede now, not in a rush, but with the measured dimming of a lamp at the end of a long evening. The seas of the ancient world settle into dark blue distance. The palaces and ports grow less distinct. The old names remain, but softly. Jason becomes a memory of promise and failure. Hecate becomes a threshold in the dark. Corinth becomes a city of stone and trade, half remembered. Colchis becomes an eastern shore where gold and wonder once gathered. And Medea herself, walking at the edge of all these places, can be left not as a scream, but as a presence. A presence can be enough. A presence can hold sorrow without pressing it. It can remind us that history is made not only of kingdoms and battles, but also of departures, waiting, difficult loyalties, and the long afterlife of a wounded name. The ancient world disappears in many ways, yet in stories like this it remains close, breathing quietly through the centuries. The sea keeps moving, the stars keep their patient distances, the old roads fade under grass and dust, but the tale still lies there like a smooth stone warmed once by sun and now cooled by night. It asks nothing urgent, it only stays, and as it stays the mind is free to grow still around it. The breath slows, the arguments of the day loosen their grip, the sharp edges of the story soften into shape and shadow. Medea's exile, so long a subject of fear and fascination, can become at last one more ancient current flowing beneath the surface of sleep. Not gone, just quiet, not solved, just carried.